let's talk about the potentially detrimental effects of love languages. So whenever I talk about the fact that love languages aren't real, I always get responses like, it's just a fun thing that helps me communicate more effectively. What's the harm in something silly and fun like that? It's not meant to be science. It's not portrayed as science. I never thought it was science. It's not a big deal. I want to share what the big deal is. And it's this, that love languages can be used to coerce a partner into behaving in a way that they're uncomfortable with. Because if my love language is physical touch, then you need to behave in a way that makes me feel loved. And so I'm not going to talk about it myself anymore. Instead, I'm going to read some excerpts from the book itself to explain where this comes from and why it's a problem. The excerpts I'll be reading are primarily coming from chapter 12 called Loving the Unlovely. To start this chapter, Dr. Chapman introduces a person called Anne, who he's counseling in therapy. Again, Dr. Chapman himself is not a relationship expert. He's a pastor at a church, and so he's counseling couples in that role, and that's where this book comes from. It reads, "Then, without any lead-in, she asked me one of the most profound questions I've ever heard. Dr. Chapman, is it possible to love someone you hate?" In hearing that question, he decides he needs some space to reflect and asks her to come back in a week. And during that reflection period, he thinks about his own difficulties in his relationship with his wife, and then compares that relationship to what Anne's going through. And here he says, "Our situation was different from Anne's. Carolyn and I had both been open to learning and growing. I knew that Anne's husband was not. She had told me the previous week that she had begged him to go for counseling. She pleaded for him to read a book and to listen to a speaker on marriage, but he had refused all of her efforts towards growth. According to her, his attitude was, 'I don't have any problems. You're the one with the problems.' A real winner." And so he reflects on the Bible. He has a couple of verses in there talking about how it's difficult to love someone who is difficult to love. And then he comes up with this experiment, which he says, if we can identify her husband's love language and she can give him love in his love language, then that will produce a better marriage. So he asks her a bunch of questions and he says things like, "Hey, have you talked to your friends about this?" And she's like, "Yeah, they told me to get out," which would be my response. And then he asks her these series of questions. So, has he treated you like an enemy rather than a friend? And she said yes. Has he ever cursed you? She says, many times. Has he ever mistreated you? She says, often. And he says, has he ever told you that he hates you? And she says, yes. So Dr. Chapman comes up with the 6-month experiment because she is desperate. She says she's willing to try anything. So they identify love languages in the situation. So Anne's is quality time. She just likes to spend time with her husband. And her husband's is physical touch, surprise, surprise, and secondarily, words of affirmation. She's told that she's no longer allowed to complain to him anymore. If she has a complaint, she needs to write it down in her own personal journal and not bring it up to him for 6 months. Then, and I'm going to read this part, he says, begin taking more initiative in physical touch and sexual involvement. Surprise him by being aggressive, not simply responding to his advances. Set a goal to have sexual intercourse at least once a week for the first 2 weeks and twice a week the following 2 weeks. And Anne responds, "Oh, Dr. Chapman, this is going to be difficult. I have found it hard to be sexually responsive to him when he ignores me all the time. I've felt used rather than loved in our sexual encounters. He acts as though I'm totally unimportant all the rest of the time, and then he wants to jump in bed and use my body." And then she's supposed to solicit feedback every month from her husband to see whether she's actually being a better wife to him. And surprise, surprise, at the end, Glenn, her husband, is like singing Dr. Chapman's praises. That poor woman. She is basically telling this guy that her husband is miserable to be around. He doesn't like her, he curses her, he mistreats her, and Dr. Chapman recommends that she just have sex with him all the time because it's his love language. And there's been literally zero scientific support for the idea that if, number one, that we even have a love language, right? There is no support for that. But also that if we give our partner the love that they want to receive, whatever their love language is, that it's gonna make our relationship better. There is no scientific support for that. So yeah, this is not really a harmless, cute little tool. So I don't really support it.